The Miami Grand Prix was not just a bad result for Ferrari. It was a moment of brutal revelation. All the work done during the preseason, all promises of evolution with the SF25, and all the optimism that surrounded the incorporation of Lewis Hamilton, crumbled in a matter of days. What was seen on the track was a completely out-of-rhythm team, surpassed in each key aspect by its most direct rivals, and by some who were not even in that conversation. To put in perspective the alarming situation, we must remember that Ferrari closed the 2024 season as a runner-up of the world. There was talk of a resurgence, of a structure that was finally doing things with order, led by Frederic Vasseur. The SF24 was a competitive car, with important victories and solid performance. But what the SF25 has shown at this beginning of 2025 is exactly the opposite. Inconsistency, technical errors, strategic failures, and above all, a total disconnection between the design of the car and the real demands of the track. In Miami, Ferrari was not only slow, it was irrelevant. Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton rolled in anyone's land. Without rhythm to attack those of front, without margin of defense in front of those behind. Finishing 7th and 8th to almost a minute of the leader Oscar Piastri in a McLaren is a humiliation in sports terms. Especially because that same McLaren was Ferrari's direct opponent in 2024, an opponent to which they won in certain circuits. Today, that advantage has been completely invested. McLaren is not only faster, it is more stable, more efficient, more predictable. Ferrari, on the contrary, seems to improvise every weekend. But the true crisis felt in classification. That was where the raw limitations of the car were exposed. In a format where the minimal difference changes your fate, Ferrari could not put any of its pilots among the top 6. Hamilton fell into Q2, unable to find the balance of the car, and Leclerc barely achieved the 8th place. The most painful, they were surpassed by teams with less budget, with fewer tools, and with pilots who, in theory, should be behind. Williams, for example, put his 2 cars in front of Leclerc. And he did it without tricks or luck, but with pure performance. That activated all alarms in Maranello. The media pressure soon exploded. In Italy, the press was relentless. There was talk of structural shame, conceptual failure, and technical collapse. Inside the paddock, rumors on internal tensions began to gain strength. Some pointed to the aerodynamic department, others to the suspension design strategy, and even disagreements were mentioned between the track engineers and those responsible in the factory. What nobody could deny is that Ferrari was in crisis. And this time, it was not a bad isolated career or a problem of punctual reliability. It was something much more serious. It was the confirmation that the SF25 was born with base errors. Errors that cannot be corrected with a simple update. The car is, in essence, the reflection of a decision badly made months ago. And Miami was the mirror that forced Ferrari to look at that reality without filters. In this context, the team faces a fundamental strategic dilemma. Persist with a broken project or assume the cost of starting again in the middle of the season. But before reaching that decision, they first have to survive the next races. And with the current level of competition, that is no longer guaranteed. Ferrari's SF25 is a car trapped in its own contradiction. He was born with the clear intention of correcting the defects of the previous model, the SF24, which stood out for its agility in slow curves but suffered in the high speed. The engineers were completely redesigned by aerodynamic architecture and car balance. But instead of finding a synthesis that offered versatility in all phases of the circuit, they created a car that sacrificed the best of their predecessor without achieving real gain. The result was an investment of characteristics that has destabilized the behavior of the car. The SF25 is now effective in medium and fast curves, but disappointing and even clumsy in the slow ones, where traction, control, and stability are most needed. One of the most critical points that explain this imbalance is the rear suspension. This was developed as part of a new set that also included a revised gearbox in mid-2024. However, the data and track results indicate that the suspension does not properly support the weight when the tank is full. That is, with the 100 kilos of fuel at the beginning of the race, the car sinks more than expected, especially in the rear, which causes a phenomenon of excessive settlement that directly affects the lower aerodynamics. This translates into an unequal wear of the soil, loss of aerodynamic load, and a feeling of progressive instability throughout the stint. The most notorious case was Lewis Hamilton in China, where this structural weakness was so marked that it ended up being disqualified by excessive wear of the car. To this is added a very delicate general behavior. The SF25 has an obvious instability in the rear, making the car difficult to control when the pilots must stop with force when they reach a curve. In these situations, the car tends to move too much, generating an imbalance that forces pilots to constantly correct. For someone like Hamilton, who bases his driving style on the precision of the braking point, this represents a constant frustration. Leclerc, meanwhile, has also expressed difficulty finding consistency in the curve entrance. Both are forced to change their styles to adapt career after a race, without having the basic confidence that the car will respond the same round after return. Another key component of the SF25 crisis is tire management. The difficulty of the car to enter the optimal thermal window has become a recurring problem, especially in changing temperature conditions and with tougher compounds. The preparation of the tires not only affects the available grip, but also compromises the entire classification strategy, where a perfect turn depends on having the tires at the exact point. In Miami and China, for example, Ferrari wasting critical time in the first sectors simply because the gums were not ready. That is a failure that affects both immediate performance and the general planning of the weekend. In summary, the SF25 does not have a unique failure, but multiple areas that interact negatively with each other. It is not just that the car is not fast, it is not predictable or consistent. And that is the worst that a team that aims to compete at the highest level can have. Each technical decision so far seems to have created a new problem instead of solving the previous one. Therefore, more than a matter of pure performance, Ferrari's challenge with SF25 is technical identity. They don't know exactly what car they have, and that prevents them from understanding how to optimize it. Faced with such a committed panorama, Ferrari's decision not to leave the SF25 before summer may seem, at first glance, a sample of stubbornness. But in reality, it is a much more calculated strategy than it seems. Vasseur and his technical team have evaluated that retiring from the project so early in the season would send a devastating message, both inside and outside the organization. Internally, it would mean assuming that all the effort of months was in vain. Externally, it would be an admission of defeat against its rivals and a hobby that has already lived too many cycles of frustration. The narrative that Ferrari wants to project is not that of a defeated team, but that of a resilient one who knows how to fit the blows while working in background solutions. In addition, there is a deeply structural issue. Redirect resources from the SF25 to the 2026 car is not as simple as it seems. The technical regulation of that season will imply a radical change in design, and there are still many open uncertainties. Leaving the current project would be blind to a car that has not even begun to be completely defined. Ferrari, for now, is not willing to run that risk. He prefers to continue collecting data, understanding the limits and possibilities of SF25, and using each race as a live laboratory that feeds future decisions. In this sense, continuing with current development is not just a defense of the present. It is also an investment in technical knowledge for what is coming. Another key element that influences the decision to continue is the duo of pilots. Lewis Hamilton is in his first year with Ferrari and is still in the process of adaptation. Breaking that process with a radical car change would be to cut learning just when it begins to consolidate. In the last races, Hamilton has begun to adjust his driving style to the SF25, even adapting his braking habits and his route in medium curves. Although the results do not reflect it yet, that progress is fundamental. For its part, Charles Leclerc represents a long-term vision of the team. Despite the inevitable friction, it is still the pilot on which Ferrari wants to build his future. For both, what happens in these months will mark not only its results of 2025, but also its confidence in the project for 2026. And of course, there is the question of the championship. Although the car's performance has been lower than expected, the season is long and the accumulated score still leaves room for comeback. Leaving prematurely would mean even before knowing if some improvements could take effect. Ferrari has already planned a series of updates that will be introduced into the next European races, especially in circuits such as Imola and Barcelona, where the team hopes to correlate the wind tunnel data with reality on the track. This is a letter that they cannot play if they renounce from now on. It is an attempt to save what you can, to demonstrate that they still have room to react, although the beginning has been dramatically failed. In conclusion, Ferrari's decision to move forward with the SF25 is not a product of pride or fear of change, but of a strategic reading of the context. The Scuderia has opted to resist, learn and correct, even when the road is full of obstacles. It is a risky bet, yes, but also one that recognizes the complexity of the moment. Because in modern Formula One, retiring early can be as expensive as following a course that does not work. Ferrari has chosen the path of perseverance. And now only time will say if this choice will be remembered as a sample of resilience or as another chapter in its history of failed decisions. Ferrari is found in one of those moments that define the character of a team. The SF25 crisis is not a simple low-performance stage. It is a structural challenge that tests the technical capacity, emotional stability, and strategic vision of the entire team. Throughout history, Ferrari has been a symbol of greatness, but has also starred in repeated errors. Today, the difference lies in the way they respond to this new blow. And that answer for the moment is clear: they will not surrender. The car will continue on the track, it will continue to evolve, and each race will be a new opportunity to correct what is wrong. But this type of resilience is not exempt from risks. Insisting with a poorly born car can drag deep consequences. It can affect the confidence of the pilots, the mood of the team, and the public image of the brand. It can even compromise the development of the Project 2026 if the problems of the present consume more resources than they should. Ferrari knows. And for that, every decision they make from here to the summer break will be critical. Each technical improvement, each result, each step forward or false will have a much greater weight than in previous seasons. It is no longer just fighting for podiums or points. It is about reconstructing a technical and sports identity that after Miami has been hard. What is at stake is more than a season. It is the credibility of a team that, after having given signs of resurrection in 2024, is now dragged again by the shadow of inconsistency. Will Ferrari revert this situation before summer? Will they be able to solve the structural problems of the SF25 without having to sacrifice the future? Can they convince their pilots, their engineers, and their fans that the course remains correct? All this is to be seen. But one thing is safe. What happens in the next 5 races will mark the fate not only of the car, but of the entire project. And in a Formula One where the margin of error is getting smaller, Ferrari has gotten into a race against time. A race that does not admit pauses, excuses, or hesitation. Only results.